Thomas Jefferson was absolutely right when he said, some 200 years ago, that the country is too big to be governed by one small group of people far, far away. And he said that when the United States was much smaller than it is today.
America is divided because our powerful federal government pits red states against blue. We need to return power to the states and to the people by decentralizing. If that fails, we must be prepared for a peaceful national divorce or face a destructive civil war. Welcome to War, Divorce, or Federalism. America at a crossroads.
Welcome to WDF. Our guest today is Mike Maharrey, a constitutional bulldog, a principled decentralist, and one of the most persistent voices in the modern nullification movement. As communications director for the 10th Amendment Center, Mike has spent over a decade teaching Americans how to peacefully resist federal tyranny using the tools the founders gave us. He is the author of Our Last Hope and Constitution Owner's Manual, and also a regular contributor at Money Metals. In this episode, we are diving into what federalism actually looks like, why Washington doesn't get the final say, or at least shouldn't, and whether nullification is just a softer form of national divorce. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Rick, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's a privilege to be on the show.
I'm very happy to have you on. I'm a big fan of the 10th Amendment Center. I brought my little coin to show you. I don't know when these were first given out.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think
I'm
what's called a lifetime member.
Yeah.
I joined, 2012 or 2013, something like that.
You're like an OG.
Yeah, maybe so. But the 10th Amendment is key to freedom, in my opinion. And that's what this podcast is all about, that because we have a very central government, top down, one size fits all, exactly what the 10th Amendment was supposed to protect us from. That is why we are so polarized. And that is why we have this sort of simmering civil unrest, if you want to call it that. And that the solution is to decentralize, or as we say here, federalize, become a federal system the way the founders intended. If we're not able to do that, and I am among many that have my pessimistic attitude toward whether we can, we really should start talking national divorce. So, Mike, let's get started first. What are your thoughts on the premise of the podcast that the centralized, powerful federal government is the source of a lot of our civil discourse?
Oh, 100% correct. I really appreciate the fact that you call me a principled decentralist, because that really encapsulates my political philosophy. I'm skeptical of government in general. We can debate the necessity, the size and scope of it, but I've always contended that to whatever extent government is necessary in the society, it should be decentralized as much as possible. We want multiple nodes of power competing against each other, bumping up against each other, being held in check by one another. That is the only way that individuals and people in general are going to be able to maintain any semblance of liberty. Centralized government just tends to expand and grow, and we've seen that vividly demonstrated here in the United States. So I think that I hate to put a percentage on it, but I'd be in the 90% if you ask me how much of the problems that we have in the world are caused by this impulse to centralize. It runs the gamut from monetary policy to things as simple as what light bulbs we decide to screw into our light fixtures have been impacted by this centralization of government.
You speak a lot about nullification, and that I think becomes very interwoven with the concept of federalism and trying to regain federalism. Again, federalism, it's so difficult, right, for typical listeners, right? You talk about federalism and you think federal, a one big government. But again, just to reiterate, federalism is a system where you have many states that are essentially sovereign, and they work together and they form a federation, or what used to be a confederation. But But that's where we have the sovereignty, and that's what we want to get back to, where there's much less power centrally, much more power given to the states to determine their own destinies. And so back to my question, this trying to get to a true federalism, nullification is very significant. You've been a big proponent. You're an expert in it. Please tell our audience what nullification is. And I have had many people say that that's a joke. It's a misdirection. It doesn't actually occur. I think they're very wrong. I'll let you have the floor.
Yeah, the people that say it doesn't actually occur have their heads buried in the sand because it occurs all the time. We can point at historical examples, and we can point to current examples as well as where states have used nullification and where it's worked. So let's first define the term. What does it mean? I mean, it's kind of an obtuse word. It's not something you run across every day in normal conversation. But basically what it means in a nutshell is that we're using state power to effectively nullify or void federal actions. Now, I think it's important to make a distinction. There's really kind of two ways that nullification can work. There's two definitions for the word in reality. The first definition is more of a legal definition. So nullification, it's something that a court can do. If a court comes and it sees a law and it strikes it down for some reason, it has nullified that law. It's literally off the books. It is of no effect anymore. It's gone. That's one type of nullification. Generally, when we talk about it at the 10th Amendment Center, we're talking about more of a practical nullification. And that's kind of the second definition, to make something ineffective or void in effect, right? So the law is on the books, but it's not enforced because it is effectively unenforceable. Perfect example in our everyday life, we all nullify the speed limit almost every single day. Speed limit says 55 miles an hour on I-275 in Tampa. If there's not a traffic jam, nobody's going that slow. They're just not. And there's no way in the world that law enforcement, short of, I don't know how they would do it. I mean, putting monitors on your car, I guess, could maybe do it. But by and large, it's impossible for that law to be enforced. There's too many people that don't care to follow that particular law, and there's not enough personnel and resources within the government to truly enforce it. They can pick off a few people here and there. They can make your life miserable, no doubt. But by and large, speed limits are not enforced. They're nullified in practice and effect. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And states can do this, and they are doing this. I think the best example that we've seen in modern times is the proliferation of marijuana at the state level. The federal government will still tell you that marijuana is completely illegal. It's barred, banned, can't have it, illegal. I can literally go up the street to a store and get marijuana. I have a little card that says I can do this. Here in Florida, we have medical marijuana. Many states, you don't even have to have a medical card. This is nullification. There is a federal law on the books. It is not being enforced. It cannot be enforced, and it never will be enforced. And I guarantee you at some point, the feds are just going to roll over and take marijuana off of the Schedule I of drugs. So this is just one example. You can apply this principle to all kinds of things, because the reason that it works is that the federal government does not have the personnel nor the resources to enforce every federal law or implement every federal program. They can't do it. If you've ever watched a drug raid on TV, you'll notice that you've got one guy with a DEA jacket and then 30 guys with like sheriff department or local police. They have to have that support. That DEA agent's not going by himself. So when you apply this principle to many other things, you can see how states can throw huge monkey wrenches into things the federal government are trying to do. Imagine if a bunch of states just said, we're not going to enforce federal gun laws anymore. Well, the fact of the matter is those federal gun laws would not get enforced because there's not enough ATF agents. So this is kind of the political dynamic that we work with within the 10th Amendment Center to try to push back against, federal overreach, which is just running rampant. So that's in a nutshell what nullification is. It's any act or action that can make a federal law ineffective and effectively null and avoid in effect, even if it remains on the books.
Yeah. The going to the example you gave for Second Amendment federal laws that are restrictive. A lot of people have called those laws Second Amendment preservation acts. When I was a legislator in my last term, I introduced that bill and we got it passed. So nullification is exactly what you say. Many people think that it means that you are saying what the federal government is saying is legal. You are saying, no, it's legal. And that's not the case. We are saying we're not going to enforce it. And so functionally, it becomes almost then something that's not against the law because there's no one there to enforce the law. If the law is not enforced, is it really law? And so the idea is that, yes, as you've said, there are far too many states for the federal government to act on its own. And so it must employ the local, county, and state officials to enforce laws, federal laws, that a state may not otherwise want to do it. And so if a nullification law comes into play saying our local people, our state law enforcement cannot help federal, that means it's not going to be enforced. Now that brings into play a term called anti-commandeering doctrine. And that plays right into specifically the Second Amendment types of nullifications. But can you go into a little bit, what is anti-commandeering? What are some of the cases that comprise it? And how is that going to be played out in the future for the states to get more control?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question because a lot of times when I explain nullification, the initial reaction is, well, you can't do that. The federal government will just override you. Well, there are a lot of really awful things that the Supreme Court has done over the last 150 years, but there are a few things that are very beneficial for those of us who value liberty and decentralization. And this anti-commandeering doctrine is one of those things. And this is effectively or essentially a legal precedent. You can date it all the way back to the 1840s, built primarily on 5 key Supreme Court cases, although there are other peripheral cases that would play into it as well. And just in a nutshell, the anti-commandeering says that the federal government cannot force a state to use its personnel or its resources to implement a federal program or enforce a federal law. In essence, what this doctrine upholds is the fact that each state is sovereign. Each state has its own resources, its own personnel, its own policies, and that the federal government can't bend the state to its will. If the state doesn't want to enforce federal marijuana laws, it doesn't have to. And this is strongly upheld by Supreme Court precedent. And it's a very important doctrine for those of us who do care about pushing back against federal overreach because it provides a legal tool for us to use. And so it's an extremely important thing. And I do want to note as well, this isn't something that like the 10th Amendment Center made up or, that some kind of modern thing. And it certainly didn't come from the Civil War, as some people will try to tell you. This idea goes all the way back to the founding of the country. And it's interesting because if you look at the Federalist Papers, which were a series of papers that were written in support of the Constitution, support of ratification, James Madison talked about this in Federalist number 46. And the question was asked, you're telling us that this is supposed to be a limited federal government, right? It's supposed to have limited powers. What are you going to do when the federal government oversteps its bounds? And Madison addressed this in Federalist 46. And he gave a series of steps that states could take. And the most significant one, and these are the exact words that James Madison used, he said that the state could refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. Think about those words, refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. That's exactly what we're talking about here. And over the years, the Supreme Court has upheld the fact that indeed states can refuse to cooperate with the officers of the Union. And there's not a darn thing the federal government can do about it. And, I'll go to another example, and this will annoy conservatives, understandably, but it is what it is. The reason that the federal government has never been able to really crack down on sanctuary cities is because of this anti-commandeering doctrine. The federal government has no authority to tell the state of California that it has to use its personnel and resources to enforce immigration law. Now, we can debate the efficacy of that policy. We can debate whether or not, California should or shouldn't, but we can't debate whether they have to or not, because that's been settled, and it's very, very important. And I think that instead of getting angry that states have used this in a way that we might not like, for those who don't like those policies, I think the important thing to do is find creative ways that can be used to push back on federal things that we don't like. I'm an equal opportunity go after the feds. If the federal government shouldn't be doing it, I don't want the federal government to be doing it, even if it's something that I'm for. And I think a lot of people need to really think hard about their philosophical position, because I think there's a whole lot of partisan hacks out there that are perfectly willing to let the federal government violate the Constitution as long as it's their guy in power and it's a policy that they like. And then they get mad when the next guy comes along. I remember very distinctly, everybody threw a fit with Barack Obama, and he talked about, I've got my pen and my phone. He was talking about his executive orders, and everybody on the right was just so angry by this. And that's what we have today. The people on the left that supported that, they're the ones that are now angry because Trump's using executive orders to do this and that. Well, their guy set the precedent. I mean, it goes back farther than that. But my point being is that we really need to get out of the partisan, I want my policy imposed, and get back to thinking, how should government really be operating in this country? And I would argue, as I'm sure you would too, that these decisions should be being made at the state and local level, not in Washington, D.C.
I used to have I had difficulty with the sanctuary cities for immigration, because I thought, well, immigration, federal, I mean, that's different than, say, whatever. But I got to thinking more about it, reading more about it, and I found my reversal very interesting. If the states were given more power, and if the federal government had much less power, and a border state had a very, very open border, that still would not necessarily adversely affect someone in another state. Because if you're allowing an open border, you don't have to worry about the fact that these people are going to vote for a president, because in our system of decentralization, that president wouldn't have all that much power anyway. And if a state was sovereign and let's say an adjacent state wasn't a fan of open borders and was a fan of citizenship, they could enact for themselves requiring the papers for work and for an ID for voting and stuff like that. And again, it really comes down to if we allow the power to be closest to the people, it always seems to solve the issue.
Yeah, I agree completely. In fact, during Trump's first term, we kind of saw that mindset evolving. We had the sanctuary cities, the Californias, the New Yorks, but we also saw several states during those first 4 Trump years that actually passed laws to really support immigration control. Texas, in particular, they made it illegal to be a sanctuary community, and so. It's as you say, as with everything, when different states enact different policies, we can see which ones work best. And typically, the cream rises to the top over time when you have a free market of competition. We love free markets when it comes to economics. I think we need to have a free market in political economy as well. And I think, going to your point, if we had a less centralized system, if the entire welfare system hadn't been centralized by the federal government, then you could also implement policies within your state. If California wants to support a bunch of people from somewhere else with their tax money, well, then go for it.
Yeah.
And then other states could say, you know what, our system's not going to do that. But with everything being centralized, then it becomes just this constant tug of war in Washington, D.C. And, Thomas Jefferson was absolutely right when he said, some 200 years ago, that the country is too big to be governed by one small group of people far, far away. And he said that when the United States was much smaller than it is today.
Yeah, I think that is inarguable. I just that's really where it's at, and trying to having people recognize the significance of that is one thing. Having, say, elected officials, U.S. Congress, act in that manner is entirely different. So that brings me to another question. Then, I'd love to see that action is taken congressionally to put limits on the executive branch where they've seemingly have exceeded it. I'd like for the executive branch itself to limit that fourth branch of the regulatory state, all the agencies and so forth. The Congress could do so much to bring us back to where we ought to be, but I don't think they're going to. And I really just don't think there's any hope of that, like zero. In light of that, would you say that on a state level, we should be asking our state legislators, our elected officials locally and on a state level, to actively look at nullification as a way of trying to reset the power structure between the states and the federal government? Would you almost say that's incumbent upon them at this state?
Yeah, I would say that's their responsibility. And it's interesting because when you go back and you look at the constitutional debates that surrounded ratification, this was kind of understood how it would work. Most of the proponents of the Constitution were asked these questions. What are you going to do to hold this thing in check? There was a lot of worry that there was the potential for a great deal of power to be centralized in a general government. And virtually everybody at that time was against that, right? The debate wasn't, should we have a big national centralized government or should we not? The debate was, will the Constitution give us this? And nobody wanted it. So if people had envisioned what we have today back in the 1790s and the early 1800s, they wouldn't have ratified the Constitution. It simply wouldn't have happened. So the understanding was that, the states are going to step up. They talked about this. They talked about how the states would jealously guard their power. And unfortunately, they were wrong about that. That's just flat out the way it is. But that's not to say that we can't get back on track, right? There's always opportunities. And again, we've seen the success in the legalization of marijuana. We could apply that to so many different issues, from healthcare to gun control to sound money. That's what we do at the 10th Amendment Center. We've looked at ways to address various policies at the state and local level. And I would say that that's the responsibility of the states. It was always intended to be the responsibility of the states, and we've dropped the ball. A lot of people want to blame the Constitution. Well, the Constitution's a failure. I don't think the Constitution itself is a failure. I still look at the document itself as a legal document, as a form of government. Not perfect, but it was certainly groundbreaking in its time. It's certainly a great blueprint even for today. But ultimately, it's up to the people. You have to have a people willing to enforce it. Words on paper don't enforce themselves. You can't blame the Constitution because it didn't jump up out of the glass case it's in Washington, D.C. and punch somebody in the face when they overstepped its bounds. It's up to the people of the state. So I think it's absolutely the responsibility of state legislatures to do that. And, fortunately, we have seen a growing movement over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. We've seen a lot more effort at the state level to address federal overreach. But there's always a whole lot more that can be done. And I agree with you completely. I don't think there's much hope, if any, in Washington, D.C. I always use this analogy. It's like we've got this broken down car, right? Batteries out of it, engine's all torn up. There's no tires. It's up on blocks. And we're going to come along and we're going to fix that by getting a new driver. Well, that car's still not going anywhere. I don't care who you put in the driver's seat. But yet that's the mentality of most Americans. We're going to elect a new president and maybe get a better Congress, and then that'll fix everything. And it never does. Administration after administration after administration, the federal government gets bigger, more powerful, deeper in debt, and you're trying to fix it at the wrong place. It's got to be a bottom-up type of phenomenon, and that is the way forward, in my view, the only way forward if we sincerely want to get back to our constitutional roots of federalism, decentralization, and where individuals in their local communities have more control over their own lives.
The debate over the Constitution between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, as you said, was really just about, is this Constitution going too far? Is it taking too much power away from the states, or is it at risk of doing so? And my understanding is putting that 10th Amendment, what became the 10th Amendment, in there assuaged a lot of the concern, because it was kind of the catch-all. It's like, hey, listen, if it's not specifically authorizing the federal government, then the federal government doesn't have to have that power. It's left to the states and to the people. And that seems like, okay, we've covered everything. Unfortunately, we're not really living by that. But is there a common, or what might be the most common misperception about the 10th Amendment that people have that you have heard or run into or need to correct?
I don't think most people pay attention to it. I mean, it's almost like a dead letter. Like if you bring it up, like, oh yeah, that's cool. But I think that the root of the problem is we have become so Washington, D.C. centric, right? I alluded to that in our political approach. Everything focuses on the president and Congress. Everything focuses on Washington, D.C. You can kind of understand how that happened just from a policy standpoint, because if I'm somebody and I'm advocating some policy, I don't know what it is, policy X. Well, it's a lot easier to go get DC to impose policy X on all 50 states than have to do the work to get it passed through 50 state legislatures. So, it's kind of the lazy man's way forward. We'll just go to the federal government. But this federal centric type of situation that we find ourselves in has really made the 10th Amendment almost irrelevant, because the assumption is that the federal government can do what it wants unless the federal government says it's unconstitutional. So we put all of our eggs in the federal basket. So basically people say, well, if the Supreme Court says it's okay, then it's okay. And the Supreme Court has taken us so far away from the original Constitution that it's not even recognizable anymore. So I really think that that's the root of the problem. We have allowed the federal government to become the arbiter of its own power. The federal government gets to decide what the federal government can do. Well, what a dumb system, right? I mean, I'm a big football guy, Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan. I'm not going to have a Tampa Bay Buccaneers Detroit Lions football game where some guy on the Detroit Lions gets to be the referee. But that's basically what we're doing here in the United States. Where the Supreme Court said it was fine. No, we can't do that. The people of the states need to be looking at everything the federal government does, scrutinizing it, and when it oversteps its bounds, saying, no, we're not going to go along with this. That's the way it's supposed to work.
Let's talk national divorce for just a bit. Marjorie Taylor Greene brought up the term, at least gave it a lot of prominence when she talked about maybe it's time for national divorce. My understanding is what her intention was what we might call a soft national divorce, meaning a divorce with the relationship that the states currently have with the federal government, not an actual secession. And my thought is, if a state is aggressively nullifying, are they not, in effect, having a soft national divorce to a degree? So my question to you is, could a state, Texas is looking at seceding, California is looking at seceding, could a state take an active role and want to, rather than secede, have a soft national divorce and say, look, we are going to nullify. We are going to reassert our sovereignty. Would that be a good way to go? The second part of the question is, aren't they still stuck sending all of their income tax money to the federal government and be beholden to the federal government in that regard?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I do think that, I view nullification as kind of the first last resort, if that makes sense. It was always considered a moderate middle ground. That term was used a lot in the 1800s when nullification was being thrown around in terms of being used against tariffs. And the argument was that, hey, we don't want to split the country in two. We don't want to completely go our separate ways. But we're not just going to lay down and let the federal government do whatever it wants. So there's this middle ground we can take where we push back and resist, but we're not completely blowing the whole thing up. So that was always kind of the way nullification was viewed. I still view it in that way. I think there is a lot of work that could be done within the nullification movement, within those parameters. A lot of things that, there's a lot of ideas out there that haven't even been tried yet in terms of ways to push back against the federal government. So I've always been of the view, let's try this first before we really talk about hard secession. But in a sense, it is, it is kind of that first step in that direction. And I would say that, nullification and secession are based on the same fundamental principle. And that is the fact that the states are sovereign. The states are the premier primary political society within the system. And they have come together, even under the Constitution, as a confederation. It's not one nation. Every time I hear, we're one nation, no, we're not. We never were. We never have been. We never should be. That was something that our founding generation balked at. They did not want that. So that's not the direction that we want to go. Nullification is based on that principle that states have the authority and the right to push back when the federal government exceeds its power, because the states gave them the power in the first place. Secession is based on the same thing, right? If a state can decide, yes, we want to be part of this union, and they all did that, whether the first 13 original states, they did it through the ratification conventions. Subsequent states did it through their own convention processes and asking to become a state. If you can accede to an agreement, you can secede from it, right? If you and I enter into a business relationship and we're going along and we're doing great, and then all of a sudden, things get rocky and we decide, I don't think this is going to work. There's no sane person would say, well, you made this agreement and you have to stay in it, right? And that's effectively what people are saying. There's nothing sacrosanct about the 50 states all being together. I mean, it could work if we had different regions. There's a lot of things that could work, right? But we're so married to this almost an idea that doesn't even exist in real life, that people don't like to contemplate those things. But I think it's very important for people to wrap their heads around the fact that there is no nation. We are a union of states, and those states have their own ability to make their own decisions and chart their own path. And I think there's value in unity, there's value in union, but there's not value in having things imposed by a government that absolutely does not represent your state's interests.
I think just having people get beyond the idea, as you said, we are not a nation and we are not a democracy. If they can actually wrap their brains around that, the rest, I think, starts, it's like we loosened up the jar a little bit. It's like, oh, now I'm starting to get this. Going back to the fact that we don't have a lot of hope for a top-down improvement. I think there are ways to do it that aren't so extreme. For instance, if they just block granted money back to the states. I mean, it would be better if the money didn't churn through and then come back to us at all. I think that's too much to ask for. But instead of having the little fingers controlling, micromanagement, if they just said we're block granting back to the states, combined with state active nullification, that could possibly be good. But let's talk money, and let's talk federal. We've got this huge looming debt we can't get control of. Whoever's not in charge says, oh, this is terrible, we have to get control of it. And then when they get in charge, then they're not as concerned. I feel like if you have this idea of sovereign states or of federation, it's sort of like we're trapped with this beast that's putting us in greater danger and greater in debt. And we don't seem to be able to get any more control over that. And you've warned about a monetary tyranny that the federal government has. How do we get away from that? Do we have to rely on Congress doing better? Or is there hope for cryptocurrency to dechain ourselves from that train that's going over a cliff? Where do you see things?
Yeah, that's where things get really... I get really black-pilled when you start talking about the economics and the finances. Yeah. And I honestly think that is going to ultimately be the impetus for real change. I think that the economic realities at some point are going to catch up with the United States. There's going to come a point where the US dollar is no longer the sole global reserve currency. And at that point, you're going to start to see a lot of ripple back into the U.S. economy in the form of worse price inflation and just a lot of things that are going to be very negative on the economy. I think that's going to drive change. Nothing drives change better than an economic collapse. Now, I don't want that. I'm not advocating for it, but that's just the reality we face. $36+ trillion in debt. And, right now we have a Republican president, a Republican Congress. And if ever there was a political environment that there was at least some fuel for, getting the fiscal house in order, they didn't do it, right? They just passed a big, beautiful bill that increases spending, that increases the debt over time. I don't know what you do with that. So those realities, though, they will take care of themselves. So then it becomes a question of, well, how do we protect ourselves from this? And I do think there's things that we can do both as states and as individuals to deal with that. And that primarily involves making space for sound money and allowing for currency competition, whether it be gold and silver, whether it be some type of crypto or digital gold or whatever it is. Allow the market to allow good money to rise back to the top. And we're seeing some states do that. They're beginning to repeal taxes on gold and silver so that it can be used as money. We're seeing states affirm gold and silver as legal tender. We're seeing states begin to hold gold and silver reserves. So these are the things that I think we have to do. And on an individual basis, I think we all need to be cognizant of the fact that the federal government's destroying your money every single day. And it's incumbent upon you to figure out a way to shield yourself from that, whether it is, storing your wealth in cryptocurrencies or gold or silver or however you choose to do that. There comes a time for individual responsibility where we can look at Washington, D.C. and say, this ain't going to get fixed. So what can we do to kind of insulate ourselves from that as best we can? And, again, thankfully, we're starting to see some strong movements at the state level that are pro-sound money. But because of taxation, because of the fact that, the federal government has the power to declare legal tender, that's one of those things that, you can't nullify your way out of it necessarily. So, we have to hope for reforms in Congress and worst case scenario, when things really, the bottom falls out of things, hopefully there's enough smart heads in the mix that will kind of rebuild things on a more sounder or a more sound basis. The thing that gives me optimism, to not be completely black-pilled, is that we live in a country that has been blessed with an enormous amount of natural resources, an enormous amount of people power, a lot of brains. We can innovate. We can build things. We can do that here. So if there is ultimately a financial collapse, I don't think it would be particularly hard for the U.S. to rebound from that, because we can actually make real stuff, right? A lot of this is just money games. The reality is we have the raw materials to be great, as the saying goes. So that is the optimistic thing. They've totally destroyed the banking and the financial system, and they've destroyed our money. But there's real money out there, and we do have resources, and we do have people power. So that is the reason for us as Americans to be optimistic. Maybe at some point when this mess gets to the point that we have to clean it up, it'll be cleaned up in a way that'll be more conducive to liberty.
I take a look at this DeFi, decentralized finance, cryptocurrency, versus a CBDC, central bank digital currency, as really the fight of where we are going to head with regard to freedom, with regard to state sovereignty, with regard to freedom in so many aspects. I think that a cryptocurrency has the ability to really free us from the chains of a large government, of a powerful government. But I think if we had a government-controlled cryptocurrency, not just a stable coin, but a true, this is our system now. We have a federal authorized digital currency. I think that's the end. Now, I mean, I really think like that's the end. It's time to pack up. It's time to look for something in the mountains or another country or something like that. Are you that black and white as I am when it comes to a CBDC?
Yeah, pretty close. I mean,
Okay.
If folks don't understand what that is, and we're talking about a digital dollar in effect, and in the extreme case, and I think this would be the end game for a CBDC, the idea would be to replace physical money with the digital currency. You wouldn't have dollars anymore. Everything would be run through this digital system. Well, think about the ramifications of that. If the government is controlling the money from its creation to the moment that you spend it, they can just turn that off, right? And, there's all of these nightmarish things, but they're not that far-fetched. You talk about Mike Maharrey said some pretty negative things the other day. I don't think we're going to let him shop at Walmart this week. That would be possible from a, technological standpoint with the CBDC. Now, if you're naive enough to think, the government's good, they would never do that, then I don't know how to help you because we have centuries of examples of the government when it has the ability to control, it does. So yeah, I think CBDCs are an extremely dangerous thing. I think the good news is that unlike a lot of things, I think people are kind of intuitively aware of this. I don't hear a lot of support for central bank digital currencies among like normal people. Of course, that's not going to stop the government from trying to implement it, but there is definitely some backlash on that already. And again, at the state level, we've seen a number of states looking for ways to block the implementation of a CBDC should the federal government and the Federal Reserve try to create one. A lot of states are changing the definition of money within their legal code to explicitly exclude central bank digital currency. Now, how that would play out in practice, we don't really know, but it is going to throw up roadblocks, just as James Madison suggested we should do. So there's some good news there, but I think if we ever do get to the point, people just kind of, lay down and allow a CBDC to be developed, I think it would be, as you say, kind of the end of freedom and a good time to, take your physical gold and silver and your Bitcoin wallet and buy a mountain maybe not a whole mountain, but a cabin in the mountains.
Well, a mountain if you can afford it. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. Assuming you don't have too much fiat currency that's been devalued, if you've got your wealth stored in something else, then maybe you can afford that mountain.
Yeah. Well, right. And if the federal government allows you to withdraw your funds beyond a such and such level.
Well,
I want to pop back to one. We were talking back on nullification and anti-commandeering. Recently I was talking with, Sheriff Mack. And so I wanted to ask about constitutional sheriffs. We saw during COVID in my state, there were a few sheriffs of counties that were not enforcing law that they thought was not just or perhaps constitutional. I wanted to see, do you think that a constitutional sheriff, when people elect a sheriff looking for, do you think that is a key factor that should be very, very prominent in people's minds, or do you think it doesn't really play out like that?
No, I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. And, I think it's easy to look at anything in isolation and say, what's that really going to do, right? I'll give the example of marijuana, and they're like, no, it's just weed, right? So you can take any individual thing and kind of downplay it and say, well, we're facing arguably the biggest government in the history of the world. Our little efforts aren't going to fix that. But when you start adding effort to effort to effort to effort, that's when you start to see some true power behind the movement. So when you talk about, nullification legislation, when you talk about creating space for sound money, when you talk about electing constitutional sheriffs, all of these are just little parts that together can become a more powerful whole. So I think that the concept of a constitutional sheriff is very important. I think they do hold a lot of power. We've seen it effectively utilized. I think one of the greatest examples was I think it was Elkhart County, Indiana. And this has been a number of years ago, but there was an Amish farmer there that was being harassed by the feds because, oh my gosh, he was allowing raw milk to be sold across state lines. And so, the feds came in and they were raiding this poor guy's farm. And ultimately, this sheriff showed up, and the feds were showing up at this guy's farm, and the sheriff showed up and said, "You're not going on this guy's property again." And believe it or not, the feds turned around and left. So it does work. It doesn't work every time, but so often I run up against this kind of, I feel like those of us who care about liberty, who are into individual freedom, who don't like the government in every aspect of our lives, I feel like sometimes we've been browbeaten to the point that our pessimism gets the better of us. And so we just don't even try. It's like, oh, we can't do anything. And I think that each of these efforts on top of each other, building momentum piece by piece over time, I think that is a very important key. If we ultimately fail and the thing falls apart, well, then, we back up and try alternate plan B. But we've got to move forward with this. And, that's a very long way to answer the question. But yes, constitutional sheriffs, that's another fly in the ointment for the feds.
I could have many interviews with you. I think it's fascinating, and you're obviously very, very well versed on these things. I'd like, if you are willing, to just run through a few quick questions. I always call rapid fire at the end of the podcast, looking for answers like in the 30-second range.
All right, I'll do my best. If people haven't noticed, brevity is not one of my strong points. So we'll try to be real pithy here.
There's a lot to cover. So, all right, is the Constitution dead, or is it just being ignored?
On life support. I think it's not completely dead. It's mostly being ignored, but I don't think all hope is lost.
If Texas and or California secede, will they be better off, and will the remaining states be better off?
I think that the states themselves would absolutely be better off. Especially when you're talking about states like California and Texas that have such large economies that they can function as independent entities. They're not depending so much on federal monies flowing in. Would the rest of the country be better off? I mean, in one sense, you're losing all of that tax revenue that would come into the federal government. So that would be less money for the federal government to spend. So if you're into federal programs, probably not better off for the rest of the country. If you're into the government being less powerful at the central level, probably better off because it would set an example.
Yeah. Starve the beast, man. Starve the beast.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is more dangerous, the IRS, the ATF, or NSA?
Federal Reserve.
Love it. I don't disagree. So the way allowing us to have fiat currency and have a money printing press in the end is more likely to be our demise than it is federal intrusion, privacy loss, and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I say this all the time. The Federal Reserve is the engine that drives the biggest government in the history of the world. If you did not have the Federal Reserve printing money, running quantitative easing, bond buying, all of those things that the Fed does, the federal government would not be able to borrow and spend to the extent that it does. It is literally the enabler for big government.
I just thought of a fake rapid fire question for you. If you could eliminate 1 year, just take that year away from existence over the last 300 years, what year would that be?
1913.
Yep.
That's the Fed and the income tax. So we'd get rid of two birds with one stone. And
Yep.
also, actually, around that same time, I think is when they made the Senate. Yeah,
Yep.
the Senate elected by the people instead of the states. So
yeah, exactly right. 17th Amendment, I hate it. It's more impactful than people think. So that was an easy one. I knew you were going to say 1913, but I agree with you. If only there was a way.
Yeah.
Do you think that they can be used in an innovative way without being so detrimental?
No. I don't think the government can do anything without being detrimental.
Oh.
Call me cynical, but that's basically my position.
Mic drop right there.
Yeah.
Okay. In Article 5 convention, positive or negative?
I lean negative, although I'm not as negative as some people. My feeling on that is that the federal government doesn't follow the Constitution that we have. I don't have any faith that it's going to follow some new innovation. So I feel like as much as anything, it is a waste of time and potentially dangerous depending on, how the process ended up playing out, which is up for debate.
Okay. Balanced budget amendment. How let me say it into a question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how helpful would a balanced budget amendment be?
1. I don't think they would follow it. They would figure, there's a lot of states that have balanced budgets and none of them have balanced budgets. So they always find a workaround to spend the money that they want to spend.
Fantastic. All right. Michael, it's been great having you on. I hope that we can do it again sometime. There is a lot more we can cover and go a lot further in depth. I know that our viewers will have appreciated you being on.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity and would relish the opportunity to come back on. It's been fun. I haven't done this in a while, so.
If you could please let our viewers know where they can find you, 10th Amendment Center, and the other projects you are involved in.
Well, the first thing that I would ask people to do is go to 10thamendmentcenter.com, and it's all spelled out, TENTH amendmentcenter.com. And you can get a much better feel for how this nullification thing works just by perusing the website. You'll get a lot of really good history and a lot of constitutional knowledge. You can check out Michael Bolden's show that he runs over there. If you want to learn about the Constitution, there's every resource in the world that you could want. But the first thing that I would recommend you do is go on the main page, scroll down and find our State of the Nullification Movement report. It's a free downloadable PDF. It's big, and we go through, we explain the principles of nullification, the philosophical and legal foundations of it, anti-commandeering, and then we show how it's being applied to all of these various policy areas. So it's a great crash course in nullification that you can have right in your fingertips. No cost to you whatsoever other than giving us your email. And then, of course, if you want to support the work that we're doing, that'd be great too. You can be a member at the 10th Amendment Center for as little as $2 a month, or you can be a lifetime member as you are and receive extra benefits. There you go, the 10th coin.
Yep.
So go there first. If you want to follow some of my work on the economy, on sound money, on what's going on with the Fed, you can go over to moneymetals.com/news, and that's our news website. About 80% of what's on that site I've written, and so you get a really good flavor of what's going on in the world of sound money and gold and silver. I do have my own website, michaelmaharrey.com, although I haven't updated in a long time, but you can find a Constitution 101 section there, my old podcast, and as well as if you want to listen to music that I've created over the years, you can do that there too. So those are the places, but if you only go to one place, go to 10thamendmentcenter.com.